Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need.
And I think if we and the climate movement want to be able to fight against that, we really need to organize the majority of society, the working class, the people who really run the economy when it comes down to it, but are all atomized and isolated and kept apart, to be able to stand together and really fight back. At the end of the day, it's about who in our society benefits from the resources we have, and who gets to make those decisions. And that's all the same fight.
You just heard Aniket, and he was referring to a recent and decisive shift Climate Justice Toronto took after re-examining their work and that of the climate justice movement in general. They wondered why, despite all the years and resources spent on the climate movement, we hadn't won yet. They looked at what might be holding us back. And the answer they came to helped them refocus, change gears, and in the end, be more effective. So strangely enough, our next two guests from Climate Justice Toronto won't actually be talking about climate justice all that much, but they will talk about how to get us there. Both of them do a really great job explaining just why, when our time is so limited and the fight in front of us is clearly ongoing, they decided to turn their focus to tenant organizing and why they think that will actually be the most effective way to protect our planet. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Violet. I am one of the two chairs on CJTO's housing organization. I'm sort of one of the people that sets up stuff like meetings for us and stuff like that, and a little bit of strategic direction. But really, we're quite a democratic organization. Kind of everybody does everything.
Yeah, I've been there before. Aniket, what about you?
Yeah, hi. My name's Aniket. I'm one of the two co-chairs of the steering committee at Climate Justice Toronto right now. I've been part of CJTO for a couple years now, since 2021. CJTO was founded originally in 2019. It was a really different kind of political moment back then. I think it came up when, there was all of the excitement around the climate strikes, the climate election in Canada. There's a very public narrative around we only have 12 years left. We need a Green New Deal. We need to decarbonize the economy. All of that's still true, but I think it was really kind of the centerpiece of our political discourse at that point. And so it was founded then through a lot of activists who came to the Power Shift conference in Ottawa at that time, eventually got involved in the climate strikes, Wet'suwet'en protests, Black Lives Matter, kind of took a bit of a dip through the pandemic, and then, started in earnest again back in 2022. And I've seen it really grow and evolve as an organization, and very happy in its kind of current campaign, which we're going to talk a lot about today.
When I reached out to you, you guys are called Climate Justice Toronto, and I was surprised in your reply, not that you didn't agree to come on because here you are, but you're like, yes, we would love to come on. However, just so you know, we've kind of shifted in our focus a little bit, and can we unpack that before we get into the details of that campaign you're so excited about?
Maybe I can start off by giving some of the high level, and then maybe Violet, if you want to get into the weeds after. Yeah. So, I think the kind of point we've been at for a while and over the last few years is really thinking about the kind of wins and also losses of the climate movement. I think that when we look at the kind of things in 2019 that the climate movement was demanding, I think we have to be honest with ourselves that we've achieved very little. At most, we've had the carbon tax and some decarbonization measures. And, I don't even think the carbon tax is that great as policy anyway, but that's a separate conversation. But there's no Green New Deal. There's no like mass expansion of housing. There's no winding down of the fossil fuel industry. There's no mass expansion of transit. Like we're on the eve of like a conservative majority government that's probably going to wash away any of the very modest wins that have happened.
You're saying this all with a smile on your face. It sounds very doom and gloom, but don't worry, we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah. Don't worry. Just wait. But I think like on one hand, like we haven't won those material things, but I think there has been a meaningful narrative shift. I mean, people do talk about inequality, about the climate, and people really, I think, have started to see a lot of these issues together a lot more, and also have started to be a bit more critical of, why haven't we won yet? I think there's this, a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, there was actually a piece in the National Observer by Seth Klein, who's a kind of prominent figure in like the NGO left world. And, I think that kind of shows, and it was critical of the climate movement. It was like, I think the title was literally something like, we need to change course, or like we're doomed, like the climate movement is not succeeding as is. And, I think that was also, the piece was also really revealing, because on one hand, it really, I think, addressed a lot of how we haven't gone big enough, we haven't gone far enough. But, I think if you like hit Control F and like look for power or working class or something, you won't find it in that piece. And I think that's also revealing of like how the climate movement, I think, has not developed a good enough theory of power, and really why it is we're in this kind of mess here, and how we've landed here after decades, and how to also get out of that, because I think there's a lot to draw on historically. I mean, the healthcare system we have, as much of a mess it is right now, it didn't come from nowhere. Our modest social security, modest welfare state, that didn't come from nowhere. There are real serious labor organizing efforts around a century ago that really laid the foundation for a lot of that. And I think, in CJTO, I think the big kind of shift we've made and has really driven our kind of approach to building our campaigns now is that if we want to win, we need to build power, because the reason that we are in this mess is because of the people with power, people who run our society. They get to make all the decisions. They get to expand the fossil fuel industry. They get to hike up rents. They get to build housing for profit. They get to decide everything because they have all of the power. And I think if we in the climate movement want to be able to fight against that, we really need to organize the majority of society, the working class, the people who really run the economy when it comes down to it, but are all atomized and isolated and kept apart, to be able to stand together and really fight back.
And perhaps you felt like organizing strictly around, not that you folks were ever very narrow-minded about what you would get involved in, but just mobilizing around climate justice wasn't effective enough to mobilize the working class in the way that they needed to be?
I think it's not even, it's that and more, I think it's that you need to be able to mobilize people to action. But, I think we also have to realize that a lot of people are not like quote unquote political in the same way. And unless we're really organizing and bringing new people into the movement and bringing new people out to take action, like we just won't have the power to win at the end of the day. And, again, it's not, I'm not really saying anything novel here. It's like the classic labor organizing, movement building playbook. You have to build a bigger constituency that's willing to be confident and confrontational. And that comes through years and years of organizing, but you have to be willing to grow and really pull people in and be really smart about that.
Yeah, I'd also throw in that I think, one of the wonderful things about climate change, to put it that way, is that it touches every aspect of society, right? And that includes sort of like real estate speculation for like farmland and who gets to like own that land. Just kind of all of these various different aspects where really like our entire kind of like productive and capital accumulation system is broken and is kind of like what's at fault, right? And so I think you can just kind of seize the beast from like any end and start like attacking it there, and just kind of like get political wins that like Aniket was saying, kind of like build power for like a broader constituency without necessarily having to go to people with like a climate agenda, right? And it remains a climate agenda because you're just like attacking the powers that have made things like this.
And so how did this knowledge, right, and this kind of tactical awareness shift your focus into tenant organizing, which is, where we were teasing the audience. That's where we're going, by the way.
We just kind of found ourselves working with different organizations. One of them was the New York Southwestern Tenants Union, and I think we had some very formative moments with them.
They're contagious, I mean, I think me talking to them a few times now, and when I emailed you, I talked about you guys give off really kind of tenant class vibes, or kind of that reawakening of how we can imagine ourselves as the working class. And yeah, Bruno has that impact on me as well.
Yeah, they're the best, right? They're very, I think they're militant. I think they're very like pragmatic in terms of what needs to get done and organizing people. And so I think being in contact with them, there was an eviction defense that happened in December that maybe some people kind of like followed on socials, that I think was like a really formative moment for CJTO of just like understanding, oh, we can win here, right? Like we can win in this arena, and there's like energy and there's people that are like willing to work with us to find solutions. And it's, this is kind of weird, but it's a little bit more greenfield than like labor organizing. And so people aren't as inoculated. The adversary isn't as prepared. You can kind of like get these wins in ways where like if you're trying to do labor organizing, I think is a little bit more difficult. And so I think we just kind of like entered the new year with an idea of how do we extend the New York Southwestern Tenants Union capacity into sort of leveraging the context that they have to like organize on their behalf, right? And once we started doing that, I think we learned that we had all of these kind of like skills that are very transferable to sort of doing organizing, right? And part of it is just like knocking on doors, talking to tenants, recruiting people, sort of doing this kind of like, face-to-face like explanation work, this kind of like agitation work. But there's also just like undifferentiated sort of like clerical work, right? For me to knock on your door, I need like a printed sheet that you can sign on to, and then we need to take your email address and your phone number somewhere and put it in a spreadsheet so we can contact you. And those are all things that we can all do as sort of like CJTO members, and in so doing kind of make these organizations happen in the buildings, right? And I think that's, we've sort of been discovering over the course of this year the extent to which we can actually, given a few kind of like tenants in the building that want to organize, show up and work with them and really make it happen for them.
So would you say that you're almost taking that York Southwestern model, although they wouldn't take credit solely for creating the model, but that you witnessed, and trying to replicate it as well as bolster the work of that wonderful group?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think both YSW and us, I think, just want to find ways to engage people such that they spontaneously want to like organize in these ways, right? And they want to form tenant associations in their building and resist things with landlords, and network with other tenant associations, right? And find sort of points of solidarity. If you and I have the same landlord, then it's in our interest to work together, even if we're not faced with the exact same maintenance issues or rent issues or whatever it is, right? And so I think, yeah, we definitely are just like looking for ways to sort of extend that model geographically throughout the city to sort of really, just use our people in the most efficient ways to make these organizations work and be able to resist landlords.
Is there any pocket of the city that's really untouched when it comes to tenant organizing, or would you say, all neighborhoods have examples to look to?
Honestly, I'd say a lot of the city is not organized, I think. I think that there's...
Not.
Yeah. I think there's there's a lot of community groups in the city, and a lot of like them do tenant organizing, and I think that's great, and I think that's really important. But I think every group in the city is quite small at most, in like a few buildings. Like there isn't like a big like citywide, province-wide, like national movement that they can kind of tie into easily and like work together on. And I think that on one hand, that's really daunting because, we're in buildings, York Southwestern is in buildings, there's other groups in the city in buildings, and they're building up lots of exciting organizing and power as well, but we're very small. I think we have to be very honest with ourselves that we don't have too much power, but there's still a lot we can do. I think on the other hand, and part of why in CJTO we really dived into this housing campaign is because I think it really suits the political moment as well. Like, I think the two big issues that people will talk about right now are either like the war in Gaza or housing. Like, I think those are the kind of two captivating progressive issues right now. And, there's a lot of organizing on the former, but I think there's a lot less housing organizing going on. I don't think there are real, I don't think there's enough like effort to build like real widespread tenant unions. There's not like big campaigns going around in like every neighborhood of the city or the province or the country. But everyone talks about housing. Everyone's rent is too high. Cost of living is awful. No one can afford a place to live. And I think that also really gives us as organizers a very exciting opportunity because, I think as much as we have all our idealism, it is always a really hard sell sometimes, especially if your issue that you're working around isn't in the limelight. But housing is. Like, you don't need to convince someone that their living situation is bad and too expensive because it is. Like, it sucks right now. I remember one time I was canvassing in York Southwestern when the rent strikes were really going strong. And I knocked on some person's door. She didn't answer. I go to like another part of the floor, and suddenly this lady's chasing after me, and I'm worried because I'm like, oh, she's gonna call the cops on me. She's like, "Where's the rent strike card? Like, I want to join right now." And it's like, it's like such a like you don't expect that, but I think it really speaks to kind of the both despair and the opportunity that there is right now.
Oh, I totally get it. I get so excited when I think of tenant organizing, and I know like Acorn Ontario is doing a lot, but can you maybe explain what it means to be in a building, for folks who aren't savvy to perhaps what tenant organizing is? So when you say, organizations are small, they're only in a couple buildings. What does that mean to be in a building?
Yeah, so I think ultimately, individual buildings have individual issues that they're facing that can be sort of like maintenance things, the above the guideline increases that landlords can sometimes put in. And so I think to be in a building, right, is to have a presence where you're able to mobilize tenants against those issues. Right. And that takes, I think, many, many forms. But I think the main thing that we kind of like rely on is the idea that there's a few tenants in the building that are willing to put in the work, to talk to their neighbors, to sort of like feel them out for where they're at, and then be able to determine as really like a collective of tenants what their course of action is going to be vis-a-vis these issues. Right. And so sometimes that happens kind of with our advice and involvement, and sort of we suggest things like, put together petitions for the landlord, find ways to like pressure them in the media, all of these kind of like political pressure tactics that we can sort of like employ to go against the landlord. But really, I think there's like a broad spectrum of activities that this entails, right? Not just kind of like that political pressure, but also just having like a social presence, right? And being able to throw like a little ice cream social for the neighbors, mixers for people to just like interact with one another and sort of have this kind of community there, right? I think ultimately what we're trying to build is just buildings where people have strong links to one another and are able to show up for one another whether that be in very like personal, hey, I need help with this kinds of ways, or just like, oh, they filed another above the guideline increase. What are we going to do about it?
I think a lot of organizers, especially if they've worked on political campaigns, will recognize that model a little bit of having a building lead, or just by starting with a singular point person in a building to help mobilize to whichever end. In an election, it might be just to knock on their door on E-Day to remind them to go vote. But in this case, it's a little more personal, but it's just to, I think, demonstrate that it can start with one person in a building with a model and some assistance. So definitely exciting when you think, not to diminish your work, but how easy it could be to replicate this over and over again, especially when you know how excited people get when they see it being done, especially when they get to see victories or pushbacks against landlords. I don't know. I think everyone likes a good fuck the landlord story, honestly, because I've rented many, 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 many times throughout my life. I've never had a good landlord once. I'm not, even now it's getting horrible with folks who can't even name who owns the property, like who to deal with. It's a numbered company. It seems so formidable, but not until you see people doing it. So I can also understand that proxy to York South Weston's resistance against that particular eviction. We had Bruno on to tell that story, and I watched it on the Instagram live. I think I alternated between your live and York South Weston's live, honestly, on that night. And Santiago was there, so I was trying to tell him like what was happening before he got there and everything. So I do remember using you as a resource, so thank you. And I got really energized, and then to hear the whole story, and it was a victory that night. Yeah, it goes, I think, back to what Aniket was saying at the very beginning, and measuring the wins and losses. And it's hard not to gravitate towards which seems to be a proven model. But are you folks going to have to change your name? Have you abandoned, and abandoned sounds so harsh, because we do talk, and you can develop on how building a tenant class, a working class, is part of the climate justice struggle. But, it kind of seems tactically you've really shifted away from that. Is that accurate? And are you going to have to change your name and all that?
Well, maybe just before I get to that, I do think your point about like how it is, there's a lot to rely on here is really true here. Like, I think that it can feel very daunting to think about like, how do I organize a building? How do I build up the housing movement? And so on and so forth. But, like what we're doing is not new. Like a lot of the methods we just take straight out of like the labor organizing playbook. Like, I think many of us are familiar with like Jane McAlevy's style of organizing, and there's so many others, like Labor Notes has many methods. And all of those methods still apply. Like when we talk about like going into a building, it's the same as going into a workplace. Instead of confronting the boss, you're confronting the landlord. Instead of, building a majority of workers, you're building a majority of tenants. Like, it is really similar in that way. I think maybe the only difference is sometimes like a building campaign can be much longer, I think, a workplace campaign, because, maybe there's 20, 30 people sometimes, and the unions are a legal, like, protected process. Like, that can move much faster sometimes, but it's not, we're not like making something from scratch. Like, there's a lot to go off of here, and I think that does give us a lot to stand on. But, I think also, like, it is a conversation all the time in CJTO of like, how much of a climate org are we? I think a lot of us see ourselves broadly kind of identifying with building the working class, with, a more socialist movement. But, I don't think those things are kind of exclusive. I think to Violet's point earlier, I think one of the kind of failures of the climate movement at points was to kind of look too narrowly toward climate itself. And I think that really started to change around 2019 and 2018 with the kind of rhetoric around the Green New Deal. Because, when we talk about, say, the fossil fuel industry, housing, transit, social security, and so on and so forth, or social welfare, at the end of the day, it's about who in our society benefits from the resources we have, and who gets to make those decisions. And that's all the same fight. Even in building campaigns we have, sometimes there are issues about overheating, sometimes there's issues about flooding and like protections for that, and the amount of regulations there exist for these things. So, even if like every single issue is not a climate issue, at the same time, those climate issues come up naturally, and the kind of power that we have to build through these campaigns and building up the housing movement is going to directly benefit all the fights of the left more broadly. So, I think it's an open question where we go. But I think the one lesson I'll take from all the history books I've read is it's better when the left works together than splinters apart.
Yeah, and I'll say I think this allows us to be like more of like a big tent kind of movement, right? I think however we kind of cut it, climate is going to long term be the issue of our lifetimes, right? Like it's such a big problem. It's so totalizing that, and like it affects so many aspects of society that it is just going to be a huge fight. And so I think even things like, well, because of the climate catastrophe, now there are more asylum seekers, and that puts pressure on housing, right? And so how do we resolve that in a way that's like humane and like and actually functional and doesn't tear apart our societies, right? And I think having like a bit of like a climate, maybe not a focus, but a sort of like impetus from this concept of like climate justice is sort of like helps us be more aware of just everything in general. I think it helps us jump into different aspects of the fight in a very generic way without having to worry about, oh, but we're a housing org. Can we really do labor organizing? Can we really do work around Palestine? This kind of thing.
I think like one of the key points that you folks have made there is that understanding of where power is and how badly that is needed in the climate justice. So although housing can be more appealing because politically people are talking about it now, or because it's such a necessity for folks, it's hit such a fever pitch, materially, that you can't not talk about it. But in that same sense that when we organize from a capitalist model and like fail to change that, we end up with these market-based solutions, like the carbon tax that we sit and waste and bicker over when it's kind of here, neither or there. But often even the victories that are secured are market-based, and that just prolongs the problem. I know you know that, right? And probably the audience knows that too. But when you see how some climate justice campaigns are structured, it's like it seems like they don't know it, or they know it, but it's just too daunting to perhaps try to fight capitalism and climate justice at the same time, as a larger organization. So it seems like you've always, your Instagram describes the group as a membership-led democratic organization fighting for transformative class-based climate action. So that class-based, always class-based, but it has to have that consciousness as well. And you seem to have taken it upon yourselves to raise the consciousness of the community. You folks held a socialist school.
For sure. I think the thing to always keep in mind is like, as organizers, our real ability is to like intervene in like working class struggles and build up power and really show people the power that they have when they stand together, and show them that they can really build up that confidence and really confront, power that their boss, their landlord, and things that they really toil and suffer under. But I think the other side of that, and I think this is really important for us, both in CJTO, but I think a bigger lesson for the left is that we also need to have something we're working toward. It can't just be that we're against this, we're against that. We also want to have like social housing for all. We also want to have like great places and neighborhoods to live in. We also want to have like a very livable economy and livable society. And I think that was, the socialist summer school we had this year was the kind of second iteration of that. And, I think it was a bit driven by, we want to bring it more into the organizing we're doing right now. Last year when we did it, it was very exciting and fun, but I think it was also a bit more removed from any organizing going on. I think it just ended up being more of a discussion group, which was valuable in some ways. But this time, we made an effort to bring out more community members, more organizers, some tenants from York Southwestern. And so what we ended up doing, and Bruno, who you had on a previous podcast, helped, was one of the main organizers of that as well. It was a collaboration between us and the tenant union in York Southwestern. We basically just over 3 sessions walked through, like, what does it mean to be a tenant? What are the kind of stereotypes people have? What are landlords? Like, what are the stereotypes people have of that? Why is there inequality? Like, what do you identify with each other? What do you see? Like, why do the landlords get to make all of these decisions? And kind of walk through that as a group with people from different life experiences, different levels of political understanding, but nonetheless, all sharing this kind of common idea that we have more together that we share as tenants, and people who want a better society, and that we can all see that it isn't fair that a couple of landlords and developers basically have to dictate the terms of the housing economy. And then really starting to think about, both from the experiences in New York Southwestern, but also in other parts of the world and history as well, like, how do you really fight back against that?
What was the reception like from participants?
I think it was really good. I think it was like a small group of like 20-ish, 15-ish people, which is like a nice, cozy group to have like a discussion with. And it was good. I think we had a lot of people participate. I think one of the things is that I think you can really forget this when you're like an organizer and activist, but like a lot of people have not done any kind of community organizing before and aren't always comfortable really talking about their politics and society and the way they feel, even if they have lots of really well thought out opinions on that. So I think it was really, I could really see the way over a few sessions, which some people who were maybe less experienced, I'm putting that in air quotes because I think that's a kind of misleading term in some ways, but how they really kind of stepped into their own over like 2 or 3 sessions and started to be able to talk more and articulate their ideas more, and also kind of see as well that it's not just them. There's a lot of other people in the same boat as them as well, and there's something to do about that. And I really want to emphasize that, like, that doesn't come through a school itself. Like, I think the basis of that really comes from the organizing on the ground, but it is nice to be able to then have a nice place to chat and reflect about that.
I was going to say, if you're seeing those kinds of experiences, it means you folks were successful in creating a safe, welcoming space as well as an informative one, because it's like you say, it's a twofold project, right? Not to just politicize people, which is like very important, right? It's making those connections. But one can't happen without the other, right? You can't start to share and percolate those discussions if everyone's not kind of feeling like it's all right. I mean, it's a tough political climate these days.
Definitely.
Violet, you are a building lead. Did you want to talk about your buildings campaign specifically and maybe talk about how it went from maybe just you to wherever you folks are at now?
Absolutely. So I started organizing the building I live in May. I live in the Davisville area, so sort of like Midtown. And we just started organizing sort of like around an AGI that had been filed, and sort of like a number of different things. There's like no AC in the building, and I think as a climate org at first that was like a very attractive kind of like issue to bring up, right? It was May, and we were looking forward to a very hot summer, and so just kind of like surfacing this.
What's an AGI for folks that don't know?
What's an AGI? An AGI is an above the guideline rent increase. So the government of Ontario sets a guideline that is 2.5% this year. That is supposed to be how much they can increase your rent by to keep up with inflation. And if that weren't enough, I guess, there is a whole process that landlords can go through, or they can file for additional rent increases over the guideline, where ostensibly they have to prove that an investment was made into the building. This AGI that is affecting my building was for a boiler replacement. So there were folks who would have not had hot water had that work not gone in, and the province considers that that's a fair reason to raise our rents, right? Which is obviously a little bit ridiculous, because what investment really has been made into the building? The functionality that was there before is still there. The boiler reached its end of life. There's like a greenwashing thing here going on as well, where you make a claim that it's like, well, but we greenified the boiler. It uses less energy than it did before.
So it'll save them money in the long term?
Indeed, yes, it'll save them money in the long term. And
Okay,
so
yeah.
therefore they should get to charge us more money. And this is kind of the logic that the province operates under, right? So anyway, because I live in the building, I think one thing that we found is that it's easier for me to recruit my neighbors. And so we formed an association. There's, several of us now that live in the building involved in the association, to where we're just like doing, figuring out how are we going to tackle this AGI thing? What kind of like pressure are the tenants in the building comfortable exerting, right? And how can we bring them along to sort of like a militant approach to this? How can we help them understand the kinds of gains that we can make if we're willing to go sort of like the full 9 yards with organizing this, right? And then just like some very like meat and potatoes things that sometimes happen, right? Whereas like I have a neighbor that has a water leak in her unit, and it has gone unaddressed now for 3 years, and it's just like leaking into her child's bedroom. There's like mold on the ceiling. It's a mess. And so that's one person's problem, but as an association, we need to be able to take care of that. So that's sort of like, I think the kind of like association side of things, the tenant association side of things. From like a CJTO perspective, I am the building lead for the campaign, because hey, it's where I live. I have a co-lead that is working with me. That's just a CJTO person, doesn't live in the building. And what CJTO kind of like provides is this kind of like undifferentiated labor, right? So boots on the ground to turn up, to knock on doors. We otherwise would have, I think, about 3 door knockers that live in the building. And it's really, really tough to knock on every door in a building with 3 people in one night. Whereas if we can pull in, 5, 6 CJTO volunteers, that's really super helpful, right? There's kind of like clerical work, data entry, landlord research, all of these tasks that can sort of like be distributed to housing members in a way that supports the association's goals, and that kind of like allows us to pursue this, right? And I think this feels very much like the kind of like beta run for what we want to start doing as an organization now, is finding people who are willing and ready to organize and just like ready to jump in, and then assigning them CJTO help, assigning them CJTO leads. We're just going to be like a touch point for like, oh, can you get like just some research on my landlord? Can you help me understand how many buildings they own, where those buildings are, who the key people are? Can you maybe help me get into touch with some of the folks in those buildings? All of that kind of stuff is kind of like what CJTO is able to provide. And that's kind of a very long-winded answer to your question of what a building lead is, right? I think we give people a lot of autonomy to just be like, hey, here's the phone number of a tenant in this building. There's the building. The 3 of you go talk to the person and go figure out what it takes to get a tenant association spun up and get them like militant and get them fighting the landlord.
I love how you're just so very blunt. Let's see how we can get started, and then how we can get them militant. Okay? Like, I know it's not like, doesn't happen like that. Not everyone's like, rent strike. I mean, that's where we're headed. But Bruno talked about that in Blueprints of a Rent Strike, and we will link that. They do get there. Yeah, it goes back to sometimes just creating third spaces, getting to know your neighbors a little more, recruiting one by one. I guess eventually, Violet, your goal would be to, ideally get someone from the building to start taking over the roles that CJTO is filling in so that they can then go replicate on another building and rinse and repeat over and over again. But you also act as a bit of a staffing agency for a lot of the great organizations in the city, right? Like York Southwestern, but that isn't the only organization you folks act in solidarity with, is it? Or is it?
I I think today it might be, other than like individual tenant associations that we work with, right? And I think like the
Okay.
staffing agency model is a very good description of I think what we want to do for the associations. But yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if I was being rude or anything. I think that's fantastic because I don't think I've talked to a group that plays that role, but it's entirely fitting with one of the themes that we talk about a lot of not repeating unnecessary work, right? Like not trying to recreate a model as though it doesn't already exist, right? So to both bolster those efforts that you admire and not worry about like trying to make it your own immediately, right? Like that it's this kind of learning curve, right? Eventually, like you kind of drift into York Southwestern Tenant Union and learn and, morph into something different, but eventually you won't drift away, but it'll be a much bigger branching off, right?
Totally.
And you've spoke to a big vacuum that exists that has my brain like percolating now of the absence of a national network or clear provincial network. I know a lot of you folks are talking to each other. You know each other, and hopefully you like call each other and ask questions and once in a while. But even I was talking to, I think, Santiago and going, they need like a place, a space where they can come together and kind of bounce all of these ideas off of one another and their failures and victories. And I don't know, I wouldn't try that. This is what happens when we do that. And, I hope that exists on some level, but I think maybe if everybody assumes that it'll just exist, nobody will create it. But, we all have our hands full. But, it is a bit of I think, a need, just hearing how much you folks have learned from working with other people and the capacity that you'll be able to have moving forward for building, what I think I'm just referring to as the tenant class. I think, Aniket also spoke to the opponent not being as well prepared, although you follow this labor model and it might take longer, it does take longer. There is that benefit that it's not an untried avenue, but it's almost like that sneaking in the side door. We've tried to mobilize the working class with a labor focus, but as we know, like not everybody is in a workplace or in a workplace that can easily be unionized. Like the more precarious employment is and shift work and all that, it becomes even more difficult. But everyone lives somewhere, and more and more of us are becoming part of the tenant class, in fact, right? So finding a way to use our power to push against theirs, perhaps at a point that hasn't really felt enough pressure, right? Because when we talk about how our municipalities are structured and the influence of developers and real estate investors have on our politicians and our homes, they've clearly gone unchecked for too long. The landlord class.
And I'll say,
so
this is kind of where the education piece comes back in, right? Like we're currently running 3 campaigns and every building is totally different. And so we're able to sit down and compare notes and compare tactics and be like, well, what did you try that didn't work? How can we engage people? How can we mobilize people? Why are you having these issues mobilizing people and they over there are not? And how can we understand how these 2 buildings are different or how the tactics have differed? And I think over time, we're just going to collect like a real playbook of how to do this, right? And I think where we're going to be happiest is we can't be going into every building in town. That's out of the question. We need people to sort of come to us and want to learn our tactics, our expertise, right? And so that we can just provide them with a playbook and begin to provide them with a bit of a network through that same kind of like educational program that we can put together for them, and just really spread the word, right? Is really what it is. It's kind of crazy, but I think there's probably people everywhere in Toronto that are sitting around thinking, God, I hate my landlord. I wish I could fucking do something about this. And we just need to get them the information for how you can, in fact, do something about this, right? I think, yeah, there's not too much of a distinction in my mind between our like organizing work on the ground, knocking on doors, and then telling people about knocking on doors, right? I think they're both a way to build up that power.
I think it's also, worth noting that, like, it's again like something that a lot of organizers have been doing recently. Like, I think I take a lot of inspiration from the Starbucks unionization campaign in the States over these last few years. It's a different game. They had like salts, they had like big unions kind of backing them in the background. But like, when they had those early victories, they really, I was reading some interviews with those organizers, and they made a very clear tactical decision that, we do not have enough paid staffers to support like a national campaign. We're going to just take the workers who just unionized and pair them up with someone in a different workplace and just let it go. And, like that's what they did.
Like reading buddies.
Yeah. Like organizer
pals.
buddies. Yeah. And, it really propelled that forward. And of course, like no two cases are the same. You always have to be creative and strategic. But, I think that kind of considering the scale of housing right now, like, and, we're not going to one building at our time our way to fixing this or getting power. So, I think the move is really going to be, as we start to develop that confidence, as we start to build up more organizers, how can we really propel like tenants to take the lead as well in organizing both their own buildings and really inspiring and helping out with other building campaigns going forward?
You don't give off the I need to build up my confidence vibe. At least not the two of you in here. I mean, I really get this feeling and this excitement that you both have to where you're going to be, where CJTO is going to be and what its impact is going to be. You folks looking to recruit more people on October 19th?
That is.
Maybe, because this is also very contagious. I am going to leave the studio in a really good mood. Like, I don't know. Maybe it's just because it's Friday.
I mean, maybe you can come to orientation.
You know what? I have the date marked down. I don't live in the city, but I do make the occasional trip, and I am stoked about tenant organizing right now, just in general. So I'll admit, although a bit of me was like, oh, it's another tenant organization. I'm going to get another tenant organization. Because, you know my show. I try to talk to like all kinds of like a broad issue, but I am really obsessed with it right now just because of all the things I've already said. So I won't repeat that. But then when you spoke of this transition too, I was just like, this is really meaningful. I think this, and it's so mature, I think, of an organization that has put a lot of their identity, I mean, your name at least, into climate justice. But then to reevaluate where the gains were being made and how you could change tack to get where you needed to go, ultimately. Anyway, I just wanted to add that in. Tell us more about the orientation so everyone else that's in the area will join you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so we'll be having our orientation on October 19th. It'll be at noon. It'll be downtown in Toronto at the CSI Spadina. I'm sure there'll be a link somewhere afterward, which I can send Jessa. I think it's a really easy way to get involved. Like we really revamped it to be a kind of like more social community event and really kind of get people in the door, get people excited, get people like out to their first canvas. And, I think like both Violet and I have said, there's so much work to do, and this is true of all organizing, but like more people's always better. If people want to get involved, like there is things to do. Like I promise you, there is stuff to do.
You will not be bored.
But I think the other side of that is like, we are like a membership democratic organization. Like housing is our only campaign right now, but I think there's a future where we also have more campaigns as well. We did briefly try out some stuff with labor and transit, and for different reasons, it didn't work out. in the past, we were involved in the municipal election in 2022. So, while I think housing is our main campaign right now, I think there's also a lot of opportunity for people who might join through housing, but might see another organizing opportunity to also develop like a future part of CJTO. I think what's really lacking, in my opinion, in Toronto, but also Canada, is some kind of left-wing organization that can really bring together a lot of campaigns and a lot of things under a common banner. So, as much as we can try to build that, I hope that people are down to do that, both through us and other orgs.
Oh, I feel like that is like that pinned item, right? Like we all have these things and we're
I'm
like, yes.
Don't mention the NDP. Don't mention the NDP.
No, I don't have time for that. You don't want me going there, but that just when we think we have maybe something fitting that role, we're like, no, no. So yeah, I don't think many people are going to disagree with you on that point. That, I guess, but that is another episode.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk about why we need something like the DSA in Canada or like something like that, but that's another episode for sure.
It is, but I do have your email address, so and I do have that discussion.
Great,
you can just come right back on and we'll have it. So I'm not dismissing it.
Yeah, anytime. Awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, next week's episode, you already got it, guys.
You also have general meetings, so if you're in the show notes, please always check the show notes. Links to these people's social media will be there, but also the RSVP to the event that they're talking about. We'll even link that Seth Klein article for reference, but just keep in mind Anikit's commentary on it because it doesn't quite fit the path that we're talking about here in terms of building working class power or tenant class power. But I really do want to thank you folks for doing the work that you're doing on the ground. Like I said, I'm very excited about it. Santiago, I know, will be very excited to listen back to this episode and hear what you folks are doing. I'll be even more tuned to your IG, but you might see me there October 19th as well. And yeah, just thanks for coming on and sharing the journey of the organization. I think there's lots of folks that it'll resonate with as organizers, right? When even if they don't take the same path you folks did, but just being able to reevaluate and make sure what we're doing is valuable for the bigger picture. Right, rather than short-term gains or whatnot, that it is kind of ideologically driven as an anti-capitalist movement as well. But yeah, thank you, Violet and Anikit.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having us. It was a great opportunity.
Oh, yeah, no, the pleasure is mine. Thank you. That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.